Hello, and thanks for joining us for this month's edition of The Scope of Things, a no-nonsense look at the realities and enigmas of clinical research, based on those closest to the action who aim for great and, if need be, are willing to shake things up. I'm Deborah Borfitz, Senior Science Writer for Clinical Research News. In today's episode, I'll be speaking with Dipak Kalra, President of the European Institute for Innovation Through Health Data, which is helping to remove obstacles to the use of real-world data in clinical trials. Welcome to the podcast, Dipak.
Thank you, Deborah.
Now, just to clarify, Dipak, by real-world data, we are talking primarily about data in the electronic health records maintained by hospitals and medical practices, but also, to some degree, the data patients themselves might be generating with all the health monitoring gadgets now in the market, correct?
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, the history has been information inside clinician-created records like hospital and primary care electronic records, as you said. There is an explosion of opportunity for us to collect more from patients. And so now when we think of real-world data, I think it's important that we give recognition to that as an increasingly valuable data source. But let's not also forget a few pockets of what I would call health-related data, environment, climate, pollution, and so on. I think they are going to play an increasing part in how we come to understand the environmental impacts on health, illness, and disease exacerbation.
Interesting.
So now I think it would be nice if we could keep in our minds a more open view about what might be relevant by real-world data.
Okay, good. But as I understand it, researchers would customarily be looking to use a subset of this vast amount of data contained in the electronic health record system to help answer a specific research question or identify a certain patient population, like everyone with a particular disease type or the same disease severity or lab values that happen to fall within a specific range. But as you well know, pulling together a research-specific data set is a Herculean task, especially if a large number of patients are involved. When we spoke recently, you noted growing interest in establishing something called research data networks that might be created to support multiple research questions. Can you elaborate a bit on what these are and where they've been established?
Yes, this is absolutely where our field is moving. Historically, in order to try to answer a research question, it would be necessary to go through quite a cumbersome process. And I think you've already implied how cumbersome it can be to get just the data on a particular sub-profile of patients who have certain disease and other characteristics. Maybe there are diseases they must not have in order to qualify for your research. And that has been cumbersome, but also it's a repeated effort every time you have a new research question that requires a slightly different group of patients. So what we are seeing now is a more proactive, anticipatory mission to connect multiple repositories of health data and to enable either a kind of strongly de-identified, fully anonymized data sets to be available for research questions, or for something that we would call pseudonymized, that is a linked version of the data that doesn't have the classic identifiers of an individual, but still has some code that allows us to link back to who the individual is if you want more data in the future. And to, rather than putting all of that data from multiple hospitals, multiple primary care physicians and other people into a giant database somewhere, like the North Pole or the South Pole, some neutral territory, we actually leave the data where it is and build connectors that could allow a query, a research query, to be run across these multiple repositories and the results come back. That means that when you want to select a subgroup of patients, that definition becomes part of your query. And it doesn't require a bespoke data collection. It's just operationally built into the query. And if a few days later you realize you want to slightly tweak that population scope, you can do so and rerun the query in a relatively painless way. So you can imagine, therefore, taking out that huge amount of pain you described, enabling faster, high-performance queries to be run, enabling multiple queries to be run in case you want to fine-tune your research question until you've got a very precise answer that's meaningful to answer your underlying hypothesis. I mean, why wouldn't you want to do that?
Right.
But obviously, it does require a significant upfront investment in the infrastructure.
So they do not exist yet. This is an idea. Is that correct?
No, they do exist.
Okay.
They absolutely exist. They are already scaling up. I'm most familiar with Europe, where there are a number of such networks already in existence, some operating at a European level across multiple countries and locations. Others are deeper dives inside a country, like, for example, Germany. But there are also networks that go internationally. So they include North America, they include Asia and other parts of the world. So absolutely, it's here already. It's just that we want more. We want to scale this up. And so the investments are still continuing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. And I want to jump to talk about sort of the, putting all obstacles aside, the usefulness of real world data in specific use cases like designing a clinical trial or recruiting for one or interpreting the results. I'm imagining that it could help inform the eligibility criteria or whether there are enough patients with a particular condition to draw statistically relevant conclusions, or maybe even at the end of a study to suggest confounding factors that influence drug response, good or bad, or might explain an unexpected side effect. But you tell me.
Yes, I think in a way it's probably useful to divide the topic that you've asked about into two subgroups.
Okay.
Because there is a little bit of a tension out there in the world between the randomized controlled trial and the real world data study, when we absolutely need both. The randomized control trial, the classical clinical trial, has very tightly specified patients and undertakes very controlled interventions with very fastidious, detailed data collection protocols. Mm-hmm. And when you want to identify certain characteristics like efficacy and safety of a brand new medicinal product, you need that quality of data, that quality of context of data capture, no doubt about it. Okay. But real world data has a lot of value as well in different ways. And so if we think about first the performance of randomized controlled trials, there are some areas of underperformance, and a critical one that you've referred to is protocol feasibility. So what we've seen now over the last several years is the scale up of solutions originating from a project that I was involved in coordinating for a while in Europe, where we demonstrated that you could run the kind of federated queries I described earlier just to count the number of patients who might be eligible for a clinical trial and to discover which data sources have which number of patients. Now, that you can't promise that every eligible patient will say yes to being in the study, but it gives you a more accurate likelihood than the traditional methods of estimating patient numbers. So these federated networks can become a valuable tool for protocol optimization, enabling faster and more accurate patient recruitment and reducing the number of protocol amendments, which are expensive and time-consuming. Mm-hmm. So this is a case of real-world data helping the randomized control landscape. And then there are other times when you actually want to perform the research itself on real-world data. Now, why would you do that? You would do that firstly because you can do it more quickly, efficiently, and at much lower cost than a full randomized control trial, but with the absolute known caveat that real world data is more messy, more untidy, has a lower quality, it has a lot of confounding factors that make it harder to scientifically interpret. Mm-hmm. So you compensate for that in a way by having much larger numbers. So what you can do is run a query on 1 million or more than 1 million, multi-million patients as a denominator. You might have 100,000 or 200,000 patients who are in your selected subset of patients of interest. And that becomes the basis on which you can then start to look for findings. Whereas a randomized control trial would never reach that level of patient numbers. So it's a different purpose. You can find small treatment effect sizes that would be difficult to discover in a randomized control trial. You can look for weak safety signals. Now, sometimes you may discover a signal that is so important but so difficult to be confident about. You might then want to run a prospective randomized control trial or a prospective observational non-intervention study under pristine conditions to really validate that signal because it's so important to get right. Mm-hmm. But the real world data has helped you know what you might want to look for.
Interesting. So let's dig now into sort of the barriers in either integrating real world patient data into clinical trials or using real world patient data as a clinical trial in any way, shape, or form. There's obstacles here, and they no doubt exist on many different levels in terms certainly of data privacy legislation, also industry resistance to doing things differently, maybe misperceptions about the utility of the data and how to access it, and concerns about data quality and basic interoperability issues, since health and research information, as we know, have historically followed different standards and rules about how things get defined. So hoping here, and I know this is the big juicy question we were talking in advance about, enlighten us a bit about the big issues at play here, starting with the biggie, GDPR.
Okay, sure. I think it is important that people understand that it's not a simple, open the door and all the data floods in issue here, that we have to be mindful of data protection and the privacy of individuals. Now, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, is 4 years old in Europe. So it is Europe's standard for protecting the rights of individuals over the uses of their data. But it would be fair to say that pretty much every country in the world has data protection legislation of some kind. As an example, in the US, we tend to think of HIPAA as the equivalent or the closest match. But there are all over the world different but somewhat overlapping data protection rules. Mm-hmm. And the second thing you could almost guarantee is that in every country around the world, year on year, things are becoming a bit more stringent. Yeah. So you won't find anywhere that the next version of legislation is more relaxed than the current. It will always be a bit more stringent still, because the anxieties and the concerns of the public are growing and not shrinking. Mm-hmm. But the principle is that you should not be using data without some basis for being able to use it, what we call in Europe a legal or a lawful basis. Now, in the randomized control trial and in classically prospective recruited clinical trials, the lawful basis for using the data is informed consent. Mm-hmm. You approach an individual, you ask them what if you can use their data or actually interfere with them by giving them a medicinal trial substance or a placebo or something, but you basically are getting permission to collect data on them and to reuse pre-existing data on them if you can. Mm-hmm. In the case of the big data networks I've described, you're not approaching individuals, and therefore you need a different approach to what legitimizes your use of data. And that really is that at the time of conducting the research query and getting the results, there isn't a realistic way of identifying anyone, because you're dealing at the point of running the queries with generating and aggregating frequency distributions, patient counts, numbers. Now, the data source on which you run those queries may be pseudonymized or in some other way protected and safeguarded so that even accidental disclosure of the identifiability of an individual is safeguarded against. And therefore, we use a different basis. And The problem we have to face is that it is almost impossible to give anybody a watertight guarantee that there is zero chance they could be identified. And the reason for that is not just about people's names leaking out through information security breaches, which is a different matter, but there are relatively distinctive patterns in data, particularly if you think about patients with rare diseases for whom the numbers in a country may be very few. There could be less than 10 in a whole country with a rare disease. And the moment you say, I'm interested in people with this disease in a certain age group of a particular gender, maybe you add one or two other constraints. They must not have had this disease or they must be on this drug. You could be down to one or two people. Yeah. Now, although you don't know who they are, there are only 10 people to choose from. And those 10 people might be known identifiably in some other place, like the membership of a rare disease charity, or they've been in the news campaigning or something. Yeah. So there are all sorts of scenarios in which somebody's identity might be inferred indirectly. And so although we can implement all of these safeguards around pseudonymization, the aggregation of data, and so on, and there are other things called privacy enhancing techniques that further safeguard the data. I don't want to go into details about those. In the end, because it's really difficult to give everybody a watertight promise, we have to balance all of that safeguarding with something else, which is actually public discourse. That is, we have to say to the public, your health data can deliver huge value to research. That research could be to optimize care pathways, help identify the best way to treat people, or it might be to develop an innovative medicinal product. It might be to develop a device, an algorithm, artificial intelligence, and so on, or to detect a safety issue. And we are going to do everything we can to make sure your identity is safeguarded. We're going to get pretty close to perfection, but we can't reach perfection. We've got human and organizational safeguards. That means people are trained in data protection. People are only allowed to use the data for the purposes that we've agreed, like scientific research. They can't, by the way, use it for marketing. If they start to get a hint of who people are, they're not allowed to do anything else that's inappropriate with the data. Organizations have, locked rooms, technical security measures, IT departments that use audit trails and so on. So we can give people a lot of assurances, but the thing we need to do to balance that is actually to get the public on board with wanting this to happen. If there's something that you don't really want to happen, and somebody says, I can do it without harming you nearly, but not quite, you're not going to agree. If there's something that people say, we're doing our level best to safeguard you, but you really want this thing to happen, people are actually willing to allow a little doubt to exist. Because they're weighing up the benefits and the risks. And that is an area that my institute is very keen to engage on, to help people to understand why it's important to use health data, what the value is, how that value translates back into the kind of innovations in care, in new products and services and so on that benefit patients. When you do engage with the public in this way, what you find is that many of them don't really need to personally benefit. What I've found so heartwarming is that people sometimes with quite a severe disease for whom the research that they are supporting would not benefit them, but it would benefit others who might be diagnosed more early and be able to be treated in a protective way, in a curative way. I found that when people really engage and understand what's going on, they are very, very often supportive. And so I would like your audience to understand that we can do all we can technologically, we can do all we can by way of training and good practices, but in the end, there is a piece of this success which lies with the goodwill of people. It has to be there. And that means we have to also make sure that when they do trust us, we use data in ways that warrant that trust. That is, we undertake scientific research, we do develop things that are health beneficial, and that we don't use the data for purposes that society wouldn't approve of.
Mm-hmm.
And if we get that right, I think we are looking at an exploding opportunity to do better with data and to really improve the health experience and the disease experience of everyone. That's what excites me. It's what gets me up in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you referred to other barriers. Interoperability is a headache. I've spent a large part of my career developing interoperability standards. I think if you said to me, do standards exist that would allow our data to look and feel consistently across databases and be queryable consistently? The answer is yes. I think that although there are a small number of blind spots, we've got standards covering probably 95% of the territory we need.
Okay.
But do we have standards adoption at that level? No. We have a large number of systems, electronic health record systems, other databases that either don't use standards or play kind of piecemeal with standards and are not capable of real plug and play that we would like.
Mm-hmm.
So another thing I'm very keen to be doing through colleagues and with my institute is to really promote the importance of joined up data, so that when we have the permissions I referred to earlier to analyze data at scale, the data is capable of being analyzed at scale. So we do need to do more to promote interoperability standards. And you also refer to data quality.
Mm-hmm.
Data quality is really variable because the incentives to capture high quality structured and coded data by busy junior clinicians, and in the future, building on a remark I made earlier about the importance of patient data, captured by patients whom we don't educate about data quality. How do we incentivize them to really care about being complete, being structured, being coded, using the right terms? It's difficult because the business models around data are very disjoint. Mm-hmm. The people who want the best quality data aren't actually the people who are spending the money to collect it. So we've got to look at joining those incentive dots as well. And that's yet another topic I'm very passionate about and involved in through my institute in Europe.
Incentive dots. Is that what you just said?
Oh, I said incentive. Yeah, I think I may have said incentivization dots. Maybe I should have said that.
Yeah, okay.
It's a phrase I've just invented now. I admit,
like it.
But it suddenly it feels like the right phrase for this point.
Yeah, I would go with that. And I want to hear a little bit more, also just about your organization, beyond just the educational aspect of it all. I think you probably have other programs, impactful projects going on or pending. Can you tell me a little bit more about what's going on with your group? Yeah.
Thank you. So the European Institute for Innovation Through Health Data is a not-for-profit organization. It's based in Europe. It was created in Europe. Much of what we do actually is physically exists in Europe, but it's not really parochial to Europe. Mm-hmm. We work across stakeholders to try to convey the importance of joining forces to get the best value from health data and overcoming the barriers. So to some extent, the messages that I've communicated in this discussion up to now with you are the kind of things we say, but we are quite practical. So we develop good practices in complying with the GDPR, the data protection regulation of Europe, especially when it comes to the research reuse of data. What are the good practices that people should use? How should they communicate to people about the way they want to use data? How should they word consent forms and transparency notices and other things? Mm-hmm. We do help with decisions about interoperability standards and mapping. We are very actively involved in data quality assessment methods, so we can perform assessments of data quality and help to look at what are the quality issues, for example, that a hospital might have that give rise to the data quality problems it's got and what might be its best strategies for overcoming those problems. Mm-hmm. Where might it internally fix its quality issues? We also are wanting to work with patient organizations quite a lot on helping to understand what the issues and concerns are that patients and the public have about health data use. And we work with other decision makers like regulators and with the European Commission and other bodies to try to help future strategies and plans work well. We are involved in a lot of European Commission-funded projects that are pushing the envelope on data use and data benefits. So, for example, artificial intelligence projects, where we are working on what might be ethical good practices. So we try to balance sort of talking about how to do things well with developing practical solutions that can help the field to do better with data and scale up.
Yeah, that's a lot. You mentioned the European Commission, and the European Commission has proposed, as you mentioned, its scope Europe a few years ago and again earlier this year, that this European health data space, so individuals can take control of the vast amount of information that's already being routinely collected on them to help improve care delivery and clinical research. Is this yet a reality? And how is or will this space be used to achieve these ambitions? And how specifically can clinical researchers in Europe and elsewhere benefit from this initiative?
Well, it's a grand vision, a grand ambition. And you could say, well, does it exist yet? Well, the answer is no. It's still a draft regulation. So nothing has been legally passed yet. But on the other hand, the European Commission has consulted over the last couple of years with a lot of initiatives and bodies that are active in these health data landscapes at country and trans-country levels. I've been involved in running roundtables and think tanks and workshops. We've written reports with many good colleagues, so not me alone. I've just been involved or helping to chair such events. But Europe has got some fantastic colleagues I work closely with. So we've given the Commission a lot of inputs. It's published this regulation, and we can look at this at two levels. One is to say the European Commission has said what it is going to do, and we can just lie back and wait for the Commission to deliver, which will take some years. Mm-hmm. And the second thing it's done is it's consolidated many of our ad hoc inputs and put them into a tidy frame that we can then take back and start to reuse already within initiatives that are ongoing. So I'd like to think of the European health data space as being both an instantiated reality to come and a momentum and a direction of travel that can inspire all of us already. And from that point of view, it's quite exciting, and we need to think about how we use its provisions already rather than waiting. Okay. There are elements of this that still need to be worked through the detail, but there are some areas that we could say already are exciting.
Yeah, we'll be talking about it then more in the future.
Well,
for sure.
I think so. Yeah, very much so. I think it's a topic that Scope Europe certainly could have as a focal point for a future event. Should you be interested? Okay. I think it could easily be a thread in a stream within the conference next year, for example.
Yeah, sounds like a great idea. To close, I would like to get your thoughts on how the pandemic, we can't, escape a conversation without talking about the pandemic lately, but how the pandemic has helped create an appetite and opportunities for real world data sharing, and what all this could mean for the clinical trials industry at large and, well, humankind.
Well, it's always difficult to find positive things to say about the pandemic, simply because one has to be respectful of the huge amount of pain and personal loss that individuals around the world have experienced. And so I don't want to appear trite or dismissive of that. But on the other hand, the pandemic is a situation from which we can learn and on which we must build, because we would be negligent if we don't. And the first one is that I think the pandemic has shown how important it is to be able to learn from big data in near to real time in a way that absolutely transcends country boundaries, in the way that the COVID-19 virus did not respect country boundaries. Our evidence must not respect country boundaries either. And so it showed us the importance of that. And it showed us, in a way, I'm afraid, how unprepared we were in a data and knowledge sharing environment to be ready to respond to that real-time need. So I really hope that the demand for us now to invest in scaling up our data and learning ecosystems is very sharp as a result. I think the second thing is the public understanding of the need to learn from data has never been more acute. And so this is a chance for us to engage with the public meaningfully and say, on the one side, look, you see how we had to learn and you see how we needed to do it at scale. Please help us, work with us to build the ecosystem that could do this again should then another crisis arise. But I think we also need to say with honesty to the public, look, at that time of that crisis, you were rather generously forgiving about the fact that we may not have dotted the I's and crossed the T's on all of the security and protection layers. At times you allowed us to learn from data in ways that you might not have been so comfortable with in a calm situation. And we will now like to work with you on defining what are the ground rules that you would find acceptable in a calmer situation so that we put those in and make sure that you're comfortable. So again, we should not take advantage of public goodwill, but we should benefit from the goodwill, the sentiment that exists.
Yeah, and I would definitely see these as hopeful signs in some sense and sort of a silver lining, if you will, of this, dreadful and dreadfully long pandemic that we are still in. Dipak, I think we all owe you a bit of gratitude as well for your pioneering work well before COVID became a part of our vocabulary to merge the intelligence gathered in the everyday, sometimes messy healthcare world with a highly prescriptive, regulated sphere of clinical trials. I expect one day we will all look back and everything that now seems like a chore will just be part of the cadence of how we handle health data and deploy it to develop new medicines.
Absolutely. Well put.
Thank you so much for being here today. So appreciate it. And as always, a big thank you to everyone out there for listening in. If you like this conversation, it is only a glimpse of what you can expect from Scope Europe presenters and panelists. Please plan to join us October 3rd and 4th in Barcelona, when clinical operations executives will be sharing best practices and discussing the new era of decentralized, analytics-driven, and patient-centric clinical trials. Save an additional 10% with the word podcast. For more information, visit scopesummiteurope.com. Bye for now.